The Behemoth Brewing Company presents the Department of Conversation with Pat Brittenden. Behemoth, give me something hoppy.
He is an author, a media expert, and the host of the Conspirituality podcast, amongst other things. We're especially wearing the LA hat for him today. Derek Beres, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Pat.
Yeah, man, I'm very excited. I'm very excited for lots of reasons. One is, I guess, a bit of fangirling to start off with from me, is that just the other day on The Daily Show, I saw you having a chat with Jordan Klepper about various things. We won't play the audio because that'll get us dragged off YouTube. So if people want to go find you yourself, they can just go look up The Daily Show and see what you were talking about in there. But what you were talking about in there is one of the things that caused me to connect and go, this sounds like a fascinating conversation, because it was to do with let's just say the COVID situation at the moment, but much bigger than that, because you talk about bigger things that to do with cults and how people are reacting to it and what people are getting in their messaging, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera from it. So but tell us about that. I mean, probably since 2005 here in New Zealand, I've been a fan of The Daily Show, obviously with the transition from Jon Stewart. What was it like? Good experience to be with those guys and get on?
Absolutely. You mentioned the word fangirling, and I would second that, because I'm a big Jordan Klepper fan, besides being a big Daily Show fan. But they had contacted me a few months prior. The team had been in Los Angeles for some award show that was happening, and someone brought up to them, have you heard about, all this anti-vaxxer rhetoric that's going on in the wellness community? And they were like, no, that's just the MAGA crowd. And they're like, oh no, it's much more than that. And when they started looking into it, our podcast was sort of right place, right time for capturing that moment. And they found us quickly and then reached out. So I was talking to them about 2 months before that, logistical meetings and where they were going to shoot and things like that. So I think it came out pretty well. I don't think it actually captured the depths of depravity which many of these influencers operate in, but it was a good taste of just what's happening in the broader wellness community here in America. And from what I understand, most likely abroad. Our biggest listener base outside of the United States is actually in Australia. So
wow.
I know there is and we have a ton of people reach out telling us about some of the things happening there. So it does feel like similar movements that are happening in predominantly wealthier and whiter nations right now.
I will stand by the statement that I've made a few times, and I just got to jot something down, because of my dyslexia, I am a very, very capable person of going off on a tangent and never coming back. So I'll jot that down to come back to it. I've been a proponent for a long time, that especially to do with rejecting of the vaccine. It's a very white, middle class, liberal, privileged thing to do on some levels. And when I say white privilege, I'm more talking the countries that do it as opposed to the individual that does it. Because I've said for a long time, you don't see a person in a part of Africa who's got an outbreak of Ebola kind of going, I'm not putting that crap in my system. I'm not putting that vaccine crap in my system. I'm going to, you know what I mean? It's and a lot of things that are in that kind of world of, what we consider to be privileged at the moment, especially amongst what could be described as European privileged countries, if that sounds better than white middle class, because we're not all that, is the amount of things in society today. And I say this to my kids sometimes, we kind of debate backwards and forwards, and I try and always say to them, well, this side thinks this and this side thinks this, and I try and get them to understand the perspective as opposed to giving them the exact answer. But sometimes I would say to them things like, if you were stuck on a desert island right now, how much would this matter? And often these things that are those things that we're fighting for, it's almost like if you're fighting, there mustn't be much wrong with your life if you're fighting against something that's designed to help save your life. If that's the hill you're going to die on, pardon the pun, you must be leading a pretty privileged, safe life. You know what I mean?
Privilege and ignorance often go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Before we started talking, I mentioned Richard Hofstadter's book, The Anti-Intellectual Movement in America, and that predominantly speaks to a privileged crowd, because when you have easy access to healthy food and healthcare, when you can live somewhere where you have temperature control, where your neighborhood is generally safe, you don't really understand the hundreds of thousands of years of biology and culture that happened to get you to that place. And even just 100 years ago, the death rate at birth was something like 10%. And so when you live in such comfort that you don't recognize it as comfort, then it's very easy to be that ignorant. And a lot of the wellness space in America, at least I can speak to most strongly, operates under those assumptions that these things are givens, not realizing the struggle it took to get us to this place.
Yeah, and the reason I jotted something down was I was talking to, and I'll send you the link because you'd probably quite enjoy it. I was talking to a professor in the middle of last year called Professor Stephen Lewandowski, and he did research on climate change deniers. But the reason I wanted to talk to him was all of the kind of deniers and all the research that came out about them can all be completely transposed into the COVID world at the moment, into the vaccine. It's like completely the same. And what I said to him, and this is probably testament to the circles I run in, much like you're talking about the, what's happening in wellness centers, which you think of sort of as a liberal left-wing kind of place to hang out with your lattes and mochachinos and that kind of stuff, is that I've experienced most kind of vaccine hesitant people prior to COVID. The ones that I've experienced are the left-leaning people. Are the hippies, the delightful friends of mine who are hippies and who don't want to put things in their bodies. And what he said to me, and this is why I think you might be interested in it, is if you got like, whatever number he mentioned, 1,000 people in a room, all of which who are anti-vaxxers, you wouldn't see the left-wing ones. They will be so overwhelmed by the right-leaning or the right-wing ones that actually they are out there, but they are insignificant proportion of the overall deniers of this science. Maybe because you're in Los Angeles, which arguably most of the world looks at as a left-wing state, that you see more of it there, but globally, I guess, or across the whole population, it's a much smaller percentage, which I found interesting because it likewise wasn't my experience.
That's true. And it is. I've lived my entire adult life in New York City and Los Angeles, so the two most liberal cities in America. But here, I mentioned this in the Jordan Klepper clip. It's about the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which identified that the top 12 influencers, all who broker in the wellness space in some capacity, were responsible for something like 70% of the disinformation happening on Facebook and social media. So even though it's a smaller number of people, their influence is definitely hitting those right-leaning people because they're all on Facebook, or at least a good number of them are, and Telegram, because some of these people are using Telegram, Gab, different networks that appeal to the right wing. So yes, in number they're small, but their influence is very large. And that's a point that I've always tried to get across, because the wellness industry is really, I've heard estimates between $40 billion and $100 billion a year of revenue that it makes. And so it impacts a large swath of the country, often without people even realizing where it's coming from.
Again, I'm just writing down wellness to come back to, because this is the point that from that conversation that I thought was fascinating. And I brought up for people watching the research that you're talking about. The first thing is that this was out in May of this year. Mm-hmm. And I heard nothing about this. I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day. We've just had an instance here in New Zealand of actually an American doctor who is now living in New Zealand, trying to get around. We have a vaccine passport. So we've got mandates here in New Zealand and a vaccine passport that, you now can't get into like hospitality areas, or basically places where masks are optional, like let's say a barber's or a dentist's office or whatever, or maybe not dentist's office, but like a barber's, without your vaccine passport. There is a doctor in Christchurch of New Zealand who has just been caught on a undercover camera sting by a news outlet, basically falsifying passports and reasons for people not to get the vaccine, like just doing it completely and utterly. I had this conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and they were talking about the American industry, and you can speak to this, and they were like, how many doctors do you think are in America? And it's like, I don't know, 1 million. Yeah. How many do you think are completely off the deep end? Does it need to be completely off the deep end to actually put out false information that then gets picked up on social media? And, if it was 1%, that would be a lot of doctors. If it was 1/10 of 1%, that would be a lot of doctors. And when you said that, I went and looked it up. And for people who haven't heard this, I think this is really, really interesting. I've got the article here if you're watching. If you're not watching, then just Google this headline yourself. If you're listening, just 12 people are behind most vaccine hoaxes on social media, research shows. So how many people do we need? And I think it mentions about the figure of 2/3. Yeah, 65%. The disinformation dozen produce 65% of the shares of anti-vaccine misinformation on social media platforms. So 12 people out of 7.5 billion, 12 people are responsible for 2/3 of the vaccine disinformation out there at the moment. And that shocked me. And I'm so glad I saw what I saw. And now that I've looked it up and researched it, and for other people, go look it up yourself. Because then I kind of go, we talk about the medical world and kind of following the science. If we've got 12 people sharing 2/3 of information, and then we've got 10,000 medical doctors and stuff sharing positive information, why the fuck are we believing the 12? Like when I say, I mean the people who are believing the 12. Why are they? I kind of know the answer to that from my previous conversation with a scientist, but why are people choosing to believe the 12 over the, let's say, 12 million or 12,000 or 120,000 doctors and medical people who are saying the opposite?
Right before we started recording, I was reading an interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's on that list. And it's a very strange interview. That's the title, and it truly is. It was on the new iteration of Gawker. He does this thing where a lot of these influencers also mimic this, which is to position the doctors who are the small number that you're referencing as the true rebels. Like, there's a conspiracy, and these are the truth tellers. If you notice, in the playbook with the anti-vaxxers is that they'll deny every study that comes out of Harvard, for example, but there's one doctor there who's proven to be an anti-vaxxer, and they'll champion being like, here's Harvard, and this is the person you should be listening to. So it appeals to our sense of distrust. There are these powerful systems in place. Remember, the anti-vax QAnon crossover with the wellness and right wing is where we started the podcast. Yep. And there's all about the deep state. So it's this idea that there are these people in power who are trying to disempower you. And these are the few people who were able to get out of the system. That's the Mickey Willis narrative. I was a journalist and now I'm out here speaking truth to power. That is a very common trope that they use. It's a technique and it works. And cognitively, we tend to be more attracted to things that are pessimistic than optimistic. It's just in our biology. And so if you have this underlying ideology that the deep state is trying to stop you from whatever, being successful or monetizing, whatever it is, and then we have this biological impulse to believe people who are feeding that rebellious instinct that we seem to have in us, then that's the toxic combination that creates so much conspiratorial thinking.
Yeah. The professor I spoke to, and I thought I'd bring it up to if people want to check it out. Episode 129, Professor Stephen Lewandowski on conspiracy theories, a psychologist based at the University of Bristol. His research recently has focused on public's understanding of science and why people often embrace beliefs that are sharply at odds with scientific evidence. So if people want to find my episode 129, check it out. He coined a phrase, motivated cognition. So he talks about motivated cognition, and what he said was, if there's three parts to a decision, there's A, your introduction, there's B, the process to get to that, and then there's C, the conclusion. If B, someone puts scientific evidence in front of you that disproves B, what you'll do is you'll just find a different path from A to C. So the evidence that gets put in front of you that disputes the path for you to get to your conclusion, you've come up with the conclusion yourself, you're happy with the conclusion, you just find a different way to get to the same conclusion. And that's what people were doing in his research. And he calls it motivated cognition. So yeah, it's fascinating, and I don't know. I guess so many people have gotten there. When I say so many, we need to be careful. I put a tweet out the other day we're hearing in New Zealand about this division in the country because of these vaccine passports. And I go, well, when kind of 92% of us are saying something, and 5 to 8% of you are saying other, is that really division, or is that a set of outliers that just are refusing to be a part of the community? It's not it's not a 50-50 thing here. So, but when you scale that to America, that 10% or 15% maybe is more, is still 30 million people. So it's still a big number.
And the number of unvaccinated in America is higher than that as well. So, and I do truly believe there are vax hesitant people. I don't think that everyone's an anti-vaxxer. I think people are truly confused, and it's understandable. A lot of those people you can have conversations with. We receive a lot of DMs at our social media sites for Conspirituality, and we've received a number of people who were hesitant and then listened to us or heard some of our guests and were like, you know what, we're going to go ahead and get it. And so there is this process of dialogue that can be facilitated through social media and other channels, but that doesn't usually inspire such emotion in us, whether it's anger or frustration or righteousness. And that's currency on social media. And that's part of the challenge that we face when you try to have a nuanced dialogue that lasts 2 to 3 hours, as some of our podcasts do, and you do long form as well. And you can just make a meme with one sentence that appeals to people and is easier to grok, then people are going to gravitate toward that. And it's one of the challenges of science communication in general.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm not trying to beat up all my previous kind of podcasts here and give them more exposure, but you're just, only because you mentioned the phrase science communication, we had another guy on recently from here, and the University of Otago is pretty world renowned and it's quite respectable. Lloyd Spencer Davis, and he is a professor of science communication, and he was saying similar things, that that's actually the area he's an academic in, and how to kind of put the message out there and how to communicate it with the people. I listen to people, not even about what we're talking about now, but to do with how we get into our tribes and the world becoming more and more tribal. And this does feel like that. And I know a lot of it's different for every other country, but in America, you're seeing, those Trump heavy voting counties are also the ones with the highest COVID at the moment and the more serious COVID interactions at the moment. And what I don't quite understand is how that can't be just dropping with people. I mean, why are all my neighbors Trump supporters? We've all got COVID, and why are all the people over there who are Biden supporters, if that is such a thing? I know there was a bit of a, the best of two bad choices sort of thing, but why aren't they? And I wonder how people break out of their tribal thought process for their own good. It's that voting against your own self-interest, because it's hard to leave your tribe. I like talking to flat earthers. To go from being a flat earther to a normal person is hard, because I mean you've dealt with cults, so it's the cult thing, isn't it?
It's the cult thing. It's also just the way of thinking, because remember, there are a number of stories where people are on their deathbed still denying it's COVID. That's not uncommon. There are people who've gotten COVID and swore that it was other things. One of the influencers that I did a video, a back and forth on, who got COVID, his name is Preston Smiles. He's based in Austin. He's kind of this failed actor / life coach now. And he literally is sitting there with COVID in quarantine from his family, saying that the reason it got so bad for me is because I had a snack with sugar in it. And it was the sugar that created this process that made me sicker than I otherwise would have. And then he's talking about nebulizing hydrogen peroxide. He's got his infrared sauna right there. He has like all of his supplements he's pulling out. And it's this cognitive dissonance that happens once you, even more than it is tribal, but you get so particularly emboldened by your way of believing about these things that nothing will disprove it to you. This is a very well-known phenomenon, but we're just seeing it at scale right now because we have social media. This probably would have happened over and over again in the past. We just wouldn't have known about it to the degree that we can now. It's instantaneous.
From your experience, obviously you're neck deep in this, and both living in America, but also, for what you obviously keep an eye on and talk about on your podcast and write about. Because I hear stories about people on their deathbed who wish they had got the vaccine as well.
Yes.
Do you get any kind of sense as to which way it goes? Are you getting these people who don't have vaccines who are going like, why the crap didn't I get the vaccine? Or is it more majority that they're just denying it right up until the end?
No, it happened to someone in my family. They are not anti-vax, but vax hesitant, not around good information enough. Doesn't listen to my texts when I get the vaccine and say I got it. It is what it is. Got hit particularly hard, not hospitalized hard, but pretty hard by it, and was like, why didn't I just get it? Why didn't I get the vaccine? And I think that is actually probably more common than the deathbed denials.
Right.
But so often it happens with a family member or a spouse. I interviewed Angela Denker, who's going to be on the podcast in 3 weeks. She's a Lutheran pastor, very progressive pastor, and her book is called Red State Christians, where she traveled around the country talking to people in her church and beyond, and just trying to get a sense of what they really believed and why. But I'm not revealing anything because she said this specifically on the pod that will be released, but she lost her brother-in-law, 43, in really good health. And now he was an anti-vaxxer, not just hesitant, and leaves 4 daughters, all under the age of 10, and a wife behind. And they're broken, all because of that disinformation. The NPR piece you shared, seeing it right now when you showed it, it says hoax, but that's not the right word for it. It's disinformation, and that's malicious intent with information, often in order to monetize, which these 12 people are doing by selling their supplements or their unproven cures. So it's a war for information now, and they will never accept the collateral damage. When stories like that come out, they will never take responsibility for it. They only want to point fingers at the medical establishment, and there are so many conflations of information we can get into there, but it's really insidious the way that they operate.
And it is so interesting to think about other people as well rather than yourself. When COVID first hit New Zealand in March of last year, the local university here said, like, we had our lockdown, went for quite a long time, and obviously New Zealand has a very successful story, especially for the first wave of COVID. We're still doing, I think, quite well, but it's not quite the same on Delta. But the local university's message was, do it for your gran, your nana and your papa, like lockdown for them, because they're the ones that are going to get impacted from it. And I read a story the other day on one of our local papers about the idea of, it was a journalist actually from Auckland, who was an active anti-vaxxer, would write about it, had his own blogs about it, and died. And yeah, he was 80, but he died of COVID. And all I could think about was his grandchildren, and so he was 80, he had a good innings, but what grandkid doesn't want their granddad for another 5 years? And the message I was putting out there was, look, if you don't want to do it for yourself, do it for your kids, do it for your grandkids, do it for your wife, because do you really want to increase the chances of leaving them behind when you can decrease the chances of this killing you? Or even what we're not talking about is, or even affecting you for the rest of your life, because the stats and people are saying, it's a 0.5% death rate. What they're not saying is also those people who have lung damage for the rest of their lives, who have, all those things aren't in those kind of death stats, which we actually aren't really talking about.
You're working on the idea that when people see advertising like that they believe the virus is real, or that it can be that damaging. And they're not working under that assumption. They are working under the idea that it's a common cold or the flu, and yeah, it sucks, but we'll get beyond this. So it's only when they see what it actually is that they'll have some sort of conversion experience. And also the reality is, and we've always known this, some people just won't get that sick.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And so that also, because and in I don't know how it is in New Zealand, but in America, anecdote is everything. We're a hyper individualist culture. And so my experience, well, it happened to me, so it must be that way for everyone else. And
Yeah.
you see a lot of that. Yeah, I had it. It was bad for a day and I got over it. And over, you'll see that. And my feeling is, good for you. You didn't get that sick. That's great. That doesn't mean that someone like me who has a compromised immune system and is a cancer survivor wouldn't have a much different outcome if I did get it, or any of the people in your life. But people don't think that way. They don't think about the collective here. So that is one of the hardest things that we have to battle.
I think, I mean, our Prime Minister here, Jacinda Ardern, who's a bit of a rock star around the world at the moment, I think, because of what she's done. Well, I should rephrase that. She hasn't done it. The team of people that she's been led by that have made the decisions. I think we're beginning, we had a phrase for a long time that we're a team of 5 million. That was the phrase that we were using in New Zealand, the team of 5 million, the team of 5 million. Team of 5 million's done very well. We're doing very well. We're a collective, I think probably because it is 18 months-ish on, that team of 5 million is a bit more kind of broken up than it was, but I think that's to be expected. But for a long time, we were that. I think we still pretty much are. Like I said, 90% of people are approaching double vaccination. So I think that's still probably the case. But because it's been going on for so long, people are getting a bit sick of it. And I think that's a harder message to sell today. But what has always fascinated me about America is, well, US, I should say, is that the US sells itself as the shining whatever it is on the hill, whatever that saying is.
Yeah.
And we hear often all the time, and in fact, I run another podcast called Elephant TV, which is a series of debates, and I want to do a debate with the moot America is the greatest country in the world, and I don't say this with any disrespect, but we often hear our American friends saying, we're the greatest country in the world, and my response is always, what's your metric for that? How do you measure that? Because I look at things like the rate of Christianity and that kind of thing in America, and that religion in particular doesn't lend towards the individualism. It should lend towards the collective and the community and the people around you. And America seems to be a fantastic country of juxtapositions, where we're the land of the free, but we've got more incarcerated people than anyone in the world. We're a Christian country, but go fuck yourselves. I want to look after myself. I'm interested as to how that. I mean, like I'm a dickhead from the other side of the world, and I've got no experience, but you're there and you're living it. I'd like to know how you see and work out what appears from the outside to be all these juxtapositions, especially when it comes to what we're talking about, that we want to keep the community safe.
I would completely agree with the assessment that this is, what metric are you using? This is not the greatest country. I've had the pleasure of working in a previous career as an international music journalist for over a decade. My favorite band in the world is actually Fat Freddy's Drop. So I actually flew to France just to see them years ago from New York City. But one thing to remember is less than half, something like 40% of Americans even own a passport. So that means the majority of Americans never even give themselves the opportunity to experience the rest of the world. And yet they'll all have opinions about the rest of the world, but they'll never have visited it. I feel very lucky, having worked for so long and traveled so much working with these artists, that it really opened my eyes in a lot of ways. And there are places I've visited where I'm like, this is fantastic. Like there are just in terms of metrics in education, in happiness, and in health, America is never near the top of the list. So what are you really measuring? Predominantly ego. And so the example you bring up with Christianity is a good one, because what's practiced in America is what's been long been known as muscular Christianity. It's really about power. It's not about religion. It's about the power, the self-satisfaction that comes with thinking you're the best. But if you actually wanted to drill down to the ethics and the teachings of the religion, none of it's being practiced. I am probably one of the rare atheists who has a degree in religion, so it's a topic that fascinates me. And I've always said, I think that religion at its best creates fantastic communities of people who look out and care for one another, but start interjecting metaphysics into it and it goes off the rails immediately. But what you're referencing is that they're not even looking out for the community. And that's a whole other conversation and podcast series, most likely. But it's a real failure of imagination to understand what the teachings of your prophet are actually mean in practice, not theoretically or up in the clouds.
I grew up in the Catholic Church, right? And I've had quite a bit to do with the Christian religion. I've always said, and I will continue to say so, the actual teachings of the Christ figure, you can't really question them. Look after the widows and orphans. Take care of yourself. Be good to your parents. But the thing about that, the teachings or the character of that figure, is it was all sacrificial. He literally, as the story is told, died for everybody else. That's how they sell the story. And so it's one of these things that's always. I worked as a talkback host for 10 years on primarily, well, only because that's where most talk is. It's a conservative, not that it sold itself as a conservative radio station, but talkback leans towards those conversations anyway. And any time we talked about, America and especially Christianity, I'd be like, but hang on, Jesus wouldn't have voted for a Republican. I mean, who knows what would have happened? I mean, any theologists out there are going to give me crap about this, but he'd be a Bernie voter, wouldn't he? The person who's going to look after everybody else and give before they give to themselves, and it's mind-boggling. Really, it feels like, again, I'm talking about that motivated cognition. They've come up with the answer that the only thing that matters in that faith is that you protect the fetus, and everything else. So you're pro-life, but we do like war still, and we like guns, and we like bombs, but we're pro-life. And it just, I don't know. I don't get it.
No, and living here, again, living in Los Angeles and New York, I generally don't experience them on a day-to-day basis. That said, I've worked remotely for 18 years. The pandemic was just a continuation of my career. It's something
Right.
I've worked from home from, and I deal with people all over the country and world in my various roles. And you'll find people right in the thick of it. Right now, the hotbed is Texas, because a lot of the conspiritualists that we discuss have relocated from the West Coast to Austin, which is sort of the meeting ground for conspiritualists at the moment. And that is the state you're referencing that is helping to overturn Roe versus Wade right now. So you can't find logic in any of this. The fact that they will protect the fetus. And there's another Daily Show segment I should add, that the person behind that bill is an incel. It's a guy who never had sex before, and he's trying to state what you can do with your body if you're a woman. That is completely disorienting, but it's true. And so somebody last night, there was a right to life rally, and somebody went by with a gun and mowed down 15 people, killed one, put 14 in the hospital. Wow. In Texas. So just think of that. Anti-abortion state with the laws that might be the reason Roe versus Wade gets overturned. There's a rally for that cause, conservation of life, and then someone with a gun comes by. And like you couldn't make this story up, but that is what we deal with all the time here in this country.
I mean, I got to be careful. I didn't want to hang out with you for an hour and do a podcast and shit all over America. It's absolutely not what I'm trying to do.
I like living here. There are many great aspects of it. We're talking about specific things. And when it comes to ego and individualism, it really disturbs me how egregious a character on the global stage America is. There are many other wonderful things we can talk about.
Yeah. Look, that's where I don't want to go. Because to be honest with you, I was talking to my partner the other day, and we were talking about an international trip we want to take, putting some money aside on what we're going to do. And my first thing is I want to go to America, because I'm just addicted to politics and, love conversations. And, the entertainment world is just where I love to talk about and interview people. I had a New Zealand comedian on yesterday, and we were talking about Dave Chappelle and all this. It was as I'm drawn to, and like what I'm wearing on and I played basketball for 20 years, and so I don't get me twisted. I don't want to make it sound like that this place is somewhere I wouldn't spit on. It's a place that I'm really intrigued to go and investigate some more. But in this conversation that we're having today about this, because I also feel like, I've said for a long time, there's that adage that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. Probably not an appropriate thing to say under a time of COVID, but it feels that's the way with the disinformation, that a lot of the disinformation is coming out of America and disseminating to the rest of the world. The high profile anti-vaxxers we have in this country, they're all citing stuff that's come out of America as well.
I remember in the early aughts, when I was doing a lot of my travels, I would go to small villages in the Yucatan in Mexico, and all I would hear was hip hop. I spent a lot of time in Morocco. I went 4 times, and walking through the Medinas, I see Yankees caps and hip hop being played everywhere. And it really hit me, having grown up in New Jersey in the 80s. Hip hop was so influential in my upbringing, and it was such a
Right.
part. It wasn't the original culture in New York, but it was right next door, and it influenced me greatly. And going and seeing that influence, there is a sense of pride. It's like, oh, this is my soundtrack to my life being played all over the place. Barcelona in '99, finding a hip hop bar playing the early '90s class is just amazing. But you're right. We export a lot of bullshit too. And that's just, I don't understand, because I'm in the middle of it. I don't know why there's such a focus on America. Maybe it's because of Hollywood, maybe because the internet. I mean, we've kind of sent media out in many directions for a long time. But I do wish that we would be importing a lot more from certain cultures and exporting less.
I wonder if it's financial. I mean, I'm just thinking about things like, you don't, like, I remember when I worked as a talkback host, I did the graveyard shift. I was absolute, the bottom of the barrel. That was me. But per capita, I had more listeners than at the time Bill O'Reilly had viewers. But per capita, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means, of course, he's able to monetize his 3 million viewers and become a tens of millions an year. I get to work an entry-level job in radio, which I'm not complaining about, and earn an average salary in New Zealand. And I just wonder, as you're saying that, and I hadn't thought of this before. Like, I like that program Shark Tank. I watch Shark Tank, and I watch people who have come in and they're saying, since we came on Shark Tank, we've now had $4 million worth of sales, and like that anywhere else in the world, purely because of population density, wouldn't be anywhere near as successful. I wonder if that flows on. Someone putting out information has that same kind of bump to make it more successful around the world, even if it's not financially, purely because of the size of America, and that's the place it starts from. I just wonder. It's just kind of mulling over as things seem to be able to grow very large very quickly within 350 million people, and then they become the thing that influences the world. Maybe.
Perhaps. And also, you hit upon a certain point to track back to the first question, which was about privilege. The rest of the world could not live a middle-class American life. Like, if the world cannot create enough resources,
Right.
and that's not just me, that's a study that was done a while ago, that if you wanted to take all of Asia and Africa and then bump them up to a middle-class American life, the world does not hold enough resources. And so money rules everything, and money is belief. I mean, that's how currencies operate, due to belief, the belief that these exchange of values and goods hold some certain currency. And America is very good at locking down ways of making the rest of the world beholden to it financially. And then that influence will then go out. Bill Maher did a segment a few months ago at the end where he was comparing Greta Thunberg's influence compared
I
to
saw that.
Kylie Jenner's, right?
Yeah, I saw
And he
that.
was right because
Who's the face of the generation?
yeah,
Yeah,
1
yeah.
million followers versus 18 million, whatever it was. But you just have to remember, and especially traveling in the circles, it seems like we broker in similar spaces, and we have people who we can have solid conversations with like this. There might be some push and pull and criticism and debate, and that's all healthy. But these are much smaller conversations than what you're going to see on Instagram when what people are liking. And when you drill down into that sadly represents a bigger population in America than the types of conversations we're having on our podcast. We've reached 70,000 listeners a week, which is fantastic. But a lot of that is international. I would say half of it's international, and which is also fantastic to me. But it just shows in America, it's not like there's this great drive for actual self-reflection.
Although then you get, maybe they're the outliers then. I mean, you get the Rogans of this world who are getting tens of hundreds of millions of downloads, doing something even longer form. And I was going to say more in depth, but that would imply that they're going deeper topically, but certainly talking for longer about stuff. So maybe there's an appetite for that, but there's not enough appetite for that to be spread over lots of different content providers. Maybe he soaks up 95% of the people who want to have longer conversations, and the other 5% is divvied up amongst the other 10,000 podcasts out there doing the same thing or something. So it seems like there is an appetite for it, but maybe not enough to go around.
And Joe, I listened to a lot of Joe Rogan years ago. I kind of trailed off on a number of characters we now sort of cover critically. That said, I'm still open, and I still think those older episodes hold value. There just reaches a threshold where it becomes difficult to actually listen to someone when you know what they're capable of and the lack of responsibility they're willing to take with their influence. That being said, if you're listening to someone like that and it's on a topic that you agree with, then time isn't necessarily that important. You also have to consider, out of 10 million downloads an episode or whatever, Spotify won't report the numbers, whatever it was, how many of those are complete listens compared to the 5-minute threshold, whatever it is to count as, a listen. So there's always, there's a lot of variables in there, but to say he obviously has a lot of influence, which is emblematic of parts of the problem of America itself.
Yeah, and also, I would like to know what his influence is today compared to being on iTunes, because I listen to him a lot, but since he's gone to Spotify, nowhere near as much. And it's not that I don't have access to it; it's just that I go through my iTunes list and listen to my podcast, and he's not there. So I actually have to make a special trip to go to his page to see who's been talking to for the last 2 weeks. And then, I'm not entirely sure about the Conspirituality podcast, how varied you are in your subject matter. But what he does, and I think a little bit, just because, not that we're doing it the same, not that I'm competition, but what I do is you speak to such a varied number and different kinds of people. Like my last 3 podcasts have been scientists, co-leader of the Māori Party, comedian. So you have people duck in for the ones they want to talk about, and then duck out for all the others. And I think that's what he's about as well. It's like I will listen to the ones that interest me, whereas if it was a tech podcast, you're always talking about tech, so you always listen. So there's roundabout ways as well.
The podcast that was the precursor to Conspirituality, the first 2 episodes were Matthew and Julian on my old podcast, which was very much that. As a longtime journalist, they were just conversations with neuroscientists, religious figures, all sorts of different people. And that is part of what was the appeal of Rogan. Was that he would have he'd have his MMA episodes, but then here he's talking to a physicist or a politician, and those are great conversations. My contention is the lack of willingness to take responsibility. That one of the common tropes that you'll hear with a lot of anti-vaxxers is mainstream media. When these figures have way more views and followers than the New York Times. So it's this real dissonance that happens when people don't understand. Maybe they don't understand the influence that they have, or they're not willing, as I said, to take responsibility. but you have to sort of create an enemy for people to listen, and they've definitely done that with media sources.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear him acknowledge that, because I watched a little bit around the ivermectin, what's it called? The ivermectin, that's right. And CNN referring to it as horse dewormer. And I heard him talking to someone about that. And he said, I've got tons more listeners than they do. So he's got to a point now where he's kind of acknowledging his size, whereas for a long time he was like, oh, I don't pay attention to that. But now I think that's more evident to him, which I remember the first time Alex Jones came back on, it was like, for the first time ever, he was like, Jamie, we should check that. We should check that. We should check that. It was almost like he'd just signed with Spotify, and he wanted to make sure he was at least putting out some, he was fact checking Alex Jones for the first time ever on some level, maybe not enough, but on some level. So things had changed. But anyway, not here to talk about Joe Rogan's podcast. But I think that's a part of the information cycle we are talking about, is like, to listen to that, you might get a 4-hour episode, of which the 3 minutes might get clipped out, and that 3 minutes is what does the world, and the other 3 hours and 57 minutes don't get listened about, which is sort of old media. Old media was having an hour radio interview, and the 60 seconds of controversy was the story that went around the world. So that kind of hasn't changed, which has then evolved into not even the 60-second clip now, but the 7-second, well, it would have been a Vine, it's now a 30-second TikTok video, which actually encompasses everything, and that's what people see. So that kind of hasn't changed over the last 30 years. It's just evolved into a modern way of doing it.
And honestly, in some ways, it's sort of benign and trite, in the sense that where have we gone? Podcasts are just interviews on radio, and they're monetized with ads. The only thing that perhaps has changed, we don't monetize with ads. We use Patreon, and because we don't want to run ads in the middle of conversations. That's just the way we go about it. So there is more of a democracy, in the sense that if you can have people support you, and you have enough people willing to, then you don't have to go that old route. But in so many ways, not much has changed at all since when I was growing up in the 80s, in the way that we monetize information.
I wanted to talk to you as well. One of the things I jotted down from about 25 minutes ago to come back to, when you did your bit with these two things with Jordan Klepper, you talked about something that sparked a memory for me, which was we had a situation in one of our areas. We don't really have states here, but it's a region called Waikato, just south of Auckland. And there was several years ago, there was a measles outbreak. And all the people who hadn't got their kids vaccinated, who maybe weren't anti-vaxxers but were just lazy and taking advantage of that privileged country we live in, where measles had been eradicated, all of a sudden they all had to go and get vaccinated, because there was a huge number of school kids in the region who were catching this virus that had basically been eradicated from our society. And you told of a similar story that happened in Los Angeles as well.
It didn't just happen in Los Angeles, but it did happen here as well, in Brentwood and Santa Monica. The main place it happened was in the Midwest. So in 2017, there was a measles outbreak, and measles were eradicated in 2000 in America.
Yeah.
But the influence, and that's one point I try to make, is people sometimes think that the anti-vax movement is new. It actually started when Edward Jenner was doing his experiments. So the anti-vax movement has been around as long as vaccines have been around. But because of Andrew Wakefield's disproven and false and malicious study on the link between vaccines and autism, there has been a strong anti-vaccination movement in America since that in 1997. So I've actually been writing about it for over a decade. So it's not like this vaccine is the new thing. I wrote about the measles outbreak when it happened, and even before that, because it just plays into the broader wellness community's scientific illiteracy here in America. And there are so many interventions that we have: antibiotics, vaccines, germ theory, the understanding that if you're dissecting a body and then you're going to give deliver a baby that you wash your hands in between. It sounds
Yeah.
simple now, but it wasn't the case for a long time. Like, this has made, or this has allowed us to go from less than 1 billion people 200 years ago to 7.5 billion years today, at 7.5 billion people today. And that is what we keep referencing as the privilege and the ignorance, because we don't live in that environment. We don't think it's real. And I'm guessing that when you had a measles outbreak in New Zealand, that there might have been some metaphysics involved when it happened, like people thinking that it wasn't really what was happening. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because that happens often here when we'll assign some sort of spiritual value to a virus because we're taken off guard by it. That's very common in the wellness industry, which is really built in so many ways on people's inability to recognize that viruses can kill you. And I know that sounds so basic, but it's absolutely the case that people think that they can drink a few smoothies, take some supplements, and they're bulletproof in their immune system.
But smoothies don't seriously cost $25 in Los Angeles, do they?
Some of them do.
It's like 40 New Zealand dollars. Unbelievable. It does lead me on to the other question I was going to ask about, which is the wellness industry. Because you are someone, and you were talking about it with Jordan Klepper about the wellness industry, and talking about what's being said in yoga studios, if that's the correct term, around Los Angeles. And I thought, oh, this person is someone who's critical of that industry. But you're a yoga teacher or instructor yourself?
I was for 17 years.
You were, okay, but you still do yoga? You're still someone who
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So you're someone who participates, but is what you're saying is that you have seen in this industry that there is the information being let out that is not helping the vaccination, for example, of the people, and you just choose to use the physical side of yoga now for your health, but not participate in the Eastern spiritual philosophy side of it. How does it sit for you?
I think that's been the case for me for a long time. I mean, I was definitely pulled into a bit of the spiritual practices early on, but I was also at the time a music journalist transitioning into a health journalist. And I specifically was writing about neuroscience for many years. And I just would look at what people were saying, and then I would just read studies and be like, this doesn't make any sense. This is bypassing in so many ways. And so being those two things, I've long rejected a lot of the common sentiments that come out of yoga studios. For example, I mentioned the breathing workshops in the Jordan Klepper piece for COVID, but one other thing we talk about are ideas like meditations for world peace. This idea that if you're in a bougie Los Angeles studio in a circle meditating, that will affect the political situation in Tibet. That's something that Americans really believe. They think that their vibrations will help across the continent. And when you're dealing with people who think on that level, it's really hard to take seriously. Yet it has influence, as we're seeing, as we've talked about in the course of this conversation.
It's so frustrating because I don't think there'd be many people out there that would think that meditation in and of itself is harmful to a person. To take something that can be, helpful and bring you peace and calm and centering, and then you add the other layer of utter bullshit on top of it, seems to take away from the goodness. I often say about when people are posting things, often people will post things online that go like, oh, that's true, that's true, that's true. That's utter horse shit. And it's the utter horse shit thing at the top that they're trying to make the big point. And it kind of negates all the good points they've made below. Sorry. That's kind of what I feel like when you're talking about, meditation and vibrations, and how, I don't know, maybe the world would be better if we all meditated and took time for ourselves to be peaceful for a bit. But then we don't want to be influenced by the layer of horse shit on top with so much of it.
I started my career in journalism as a local news reporter. And so I would drive around to zoning board meetings where how your city is divided up and what's labeled business and home and taxes and street cleaning and all the nuts and bolts of a society, that's where they're decided and voted on. And then you go to school board meetings and you talk about the educational process, and that there's a real detachment in America. So many people don't participate politically. And if you think about the numbers of people who came out for Trump and then the Trump Biden, and think about the fact that so many of those people in the millions hadn't voted before, their entry point to any understanding of politics is what they're reading on their chosen media sources, and a lot of them being Fox News or things of that nature, or Facebook, even worse. And so that lack of civic engagement that is so deep here, because you don't have to partake on any civic level except paying taxes if you don't want to, and plenty of people find ways around that as well. So then when something happens where you're called to actually participate in civics, which is what taking a vaccine is on a number of levels, any public health civic practice, they're not going to have any awareness of what that actually means or entails. And so that also gets back to the question about how I can do yoga but not get caught up in all the jargon, because my experiences have led me to have a different understanding of politics and how they work than a lot of the people who are drawn to that. I don't know if I want to say a lot of, because it's also similar. I would say most people in America who practice yoga and even teach yoga are vaccinated, have a basic understanding of science, and actually care about other people. But we tend, again, to focus on that minority, and that is also the case in this industry.
Do you think, I was going to say the example of the person, the conversation I had before about the layer of horseshit, I was talking to a teacher in New Zealand a couple of weekends ago who, when the vaccine passport mandate came in, she was losing her job. And that's because she was choosing to not be vaccinated over keeping her job. And she was talking about the problems that have happened with COVID. And she talked about, businesses being lost. I think it's a really interesting and valuable conversation to have. She was talking about, anxiety levels of people going through the roof. Like, I felt that. I think it's a valid and important conversation to talk about. And then she said, and, suicide numbers have gone through the roof. That is horse shit in New Zealand. Within weeks of that, there was research that had come out there saying for the past 3 years, any suicide is a horrific tragedy, but our numbers have been trending down. And I was like, it just made me sad after I'd finished with her, because I was like, that conversation around businesses failing and about anxiety, great conversations, but she that was her cake. And then she kind of iced it with this utter horse shit, which was the headline she wanted to grab, because, what that meant was the government is causing more people to kill themselves than ever before. And it wasn't true. And it's, these important conversations are being lost a little bit with the I'd say it again, the horseshit icing that people are putting on top of it, which is, I think, unfortunate and harmful to the overall way we as a society are getting through this current time as well.
One thing we talk about often is that conspiracy theories always have an element of truth. They can't be completely made up out of thin air, or else there's no foundation there. So just a basic one, again, the notion of a deep state. Yeah, the government usually isn't looking out for the best of most people in this country. It's also, I find it funny when people, and there have been a number of people who claim that I get paid by pharmaceutical companies for this podcast.
Oh, you're a shill.
And my last book was on psychedelic therapy, and half the book was criticizing the pharmaceutical industry for what they've done with antidepressants and how they've clinicalized what could just be passing depression and then monetized it by getting people into the pharmacology of it instead of talk therapy or other forms of interventions. I've almost lost a few close people in my life to opioids, and what the Sacklers and Purdue did with that is a travesty, and they should lose all of their money. They should be held accountable. I've been critical of the ketamine therapy studies, which were, in my estimation, mishandled, but that's what allowed for FDA regulation. Ketamine isn't even a psychedelic, and it's presented as such in America. It's a dissociative. And so I've spent at least a decade criticizing this industry. I can do all those things and still understand that the vaccine works. And
Yeah.
it's only because I say that the vaccine works, people get up in arms, because that's where I'm mostly known in that lane. But I'm like, I am probably with you on 98% of your beliefs of the pharmaceutical industry, but not this one.
Yeah.
And you've closed off any opportunity for discussion when you're so vehemently against something that you actually don't know much about.
You sound like you're a bit like me, as I kind of consider myself a realist. You know, it's like I can say, this is good, this is good, this is good. Don't agree with that. This is good, this is okay. Don't agree with that. Of all the same community or society or whatever it is. The unfortunate thing about people like us, and I'll say like us, is that it's the edges. It's those 5% on either end that are hosting podcasts or on television shows that are screaming the utter bullshit from one end or the other, who aren't finding that balance, who are saying, like not to reference this lady again, but you know, one of the things she said was, well, COVID's not such a big problem in New Zealand. And I said, why is that? And she kind of fumbled around, and I said, is it possibly because the government's done a good job up until this point of keeping COVID out of there? And she couldn't do it. She actually said, I've got no comment on that. You know, so she couldn't actually compartmentalize that she disagrees with what the government's doing now with mandate. Fine, but she couldn't then compartmentalize to going, actually, the reason we've got such few numbers up until recently was because they actually did something good. And I think that makes for realistic conversations and real world applications. But sometimes, speaking now as a podcaster, it makes for some not quite as popular content, not leave blood on the floor.
Yeah, and you've mentioned the word tribe before, and we experience a good amount of that, because Matthew, Julian, and myself are generally aligned on the big picture, but when you drill down, we have differing beliefs on things. And one example is I'm a fan of Bill Maher.
Yep.
And probably a quarter of what he says I don't agree with. But I don't shut him off because of that. When he might say something and I might yell at the TV for a moment, but then the next point is valid. And I do often wonder about this, and I've entertained it before with the other hosts, but what is that threshold? Like, when do you go from being like, I can't take you seriously at all? Like,
yeah,
for example, if someone's a white nationalist, I might agree with them on economics on some level, but I'm not going to listen to or, bump anything they say in any capacity. But there are a number of figures. We're doing an episode next week on Sam Harris, because Matthew is particularly against Sam Harris, and Julian and I are like, yeah, we're fans, although we don't agree with him and everything. And so that was one figure that's like a wedge right now in our community. So we're going to have that discussion. But it's really important to have those discussions. And I obviously lean left in a lot of my politics, but we do have problems with anecdotes here, like I said earlier, with people taking their life experience and thinking everyone should automatically just conform to that experience. And the more we go down that hole, the less opportunities we're having for good conversations.
And look, whilst people are watching, there's the podcast up there on the screen, conspirituality.net. I think you've also just hit on something as we come towards the end of this conversation, about something I've been talking about a bit recently. We hear people say a lot, don't deny my existence. You're denying my existence. It's a common parlance in areas of, if people are trying to make a point about gender or about, their outlook on the world or whatever it is. It's like, you're denying my existence. And as gently as I can, when people say that to me about whatever it is, I go, you have to understand that your existence is deemed anecdotal evidence, because your existence and your experiences may not accurately reflect the data that could show something different. So I don't want to disrespect you, and I don't want to deny what you've been through, but you also need to know that what you've been through, what you've experienced, what you think may not be representative of the broader body. It's what I would think of as anecdotal evidence. And I think in society today, and it's interesting to hear you would say that about America, I think that's broader. I think that's becoming a much more of a millennial Gen Z, as we say Z in New Zealand, a Gen Z conversation about my experiences are foolproof or are, absolute truth. My experiences are absolute truth, whereas it's not the case. And it's hard to say that to someone without sounding like an absolute prick. But I think it's an important thing to remember that your experiences, much like you mentioned before about someone getting through COVID easily, may not be an accurate representation on, what the data shows for everybody else.
I was in a conversation earlier today with a new project and working with a new team, and they were talking about the feedback process and how there's criticism sometimes. And the way that they were handling it was like, some people aren't okay with this, and so we have to make sure. And I'm like, criticism is how things get stronger. It's how you build things. And these people were a little younger than me by like a generation, right? I'm 46. They were in the late 20s. I'm 46. And I said, don't worry about criticism. Like, that's how these projects get better. And I wish I could just take that moment, extrapolate from it, and then just put it over America in general. Because even as you said before, you don't want to seem like we're both just shitting on America. And you have to criticize the things that you love if you want them to get better. America is an ideal. It's an idea and trying to be an ideal. And that's been its case for its entire existence. Terrible atrocities aside, I'm just talking about how most people think about that shining city on the hill that you referenced earlier. And it's an aspirational model that has never lived up to its full potential, but it's always in motion. But it requires that level of criticism in order to keep getting there. And that's something I'm worried that we're losing right now. And these things are cyclical, and hopefully it will come back. But it's a pretty dark place right now in a lot of ways. And I don't know how long this particular cycle is going to last. But referencing your point, it needs critics, because if there aren't critics trying to at least take a holistic view of what we're looking at, then we're really doomed.
I feel like it's time for us to wrap up, but just as you say that, it makes me think about the current conversation that's in a lot of parts of society about, how comedians are and aren't supposed to speak and act, and what they are allowed to joke about and aren't allowed to joke about. And, we all know the adage that in medieval times, the only person that could speak the truth to the king without fear of getting their head cut off was the jester. And for so much of, I think of, the last 100 years, let's say, the comics are the ones who have sort of got us to reflect so much on society, the goods and the bads, and been the ones that have been able to call out the king, so to speak. And I think that they're such a vital part of society today, sort of as our critics as well as our greatest supporters, that I wonder, I feel like we're in a really transitional stage right now. I've been having a Twitter conversation with someone the last 24 hours about, I filled out a form on Twitter, and the form asked me a question: do you identify as, or are you disabled? And I was like, I am either disabled or I'm not. Like, I was trying to get to terms with the fact of identifying as disabled. And I've been getting pushback, and people are saying, well, you might not feel this. I'm just like, my summary for that, and for a lot of conversations like that at the moment, is I really do think we're in a transitional stage in the English language at the moment. And we haven't yet landed on what the future, English 2.0 is going to look like and sound like and mean. And I wonder about things like comedians, and I wonder about things like, what words we're using and what they mean. And like, we've just had legislation in New Zealand passed 2 days ago that people can now self-identify on their birth certificate. And on our birth certificate, we have our sex, yet everyone's celebrating the ability to now change their gender on their birth certificate. And I'm like, well, I'm interested into why we're using different words when for such a long time we've been told that sex and gender are separate, and now we're joining. So I think a part of all of this is we're in flux in our language at the moment. And, maybe in 5 or 10 or 20 years time, we'll have gone through that, and we'll have an easier understanding of some of these things, what quote isn't unquote allowed to be said, because we'll have decided as a community, what words mean what, and we're not there yet, just literally in this current time.
I hope that's the case. On my previous podcast, one of the last episodes I had was with Dan Carlin, who has a podcast called Hardcore History. It's fantastic. He hasn't done it in a while, though. He's a real history buff, and I highly recommend it. And I asked him, when the further you go back in time, the fewer resources you have to pull from. And so you really have to get liberal with your construction of the narrative. And you can't just read the hieroglyph or whatever it is. You have to have a broad understanding of the archaeology and everything around it. But as you go through time, you get more and more information. It's easier to piece history together. But now with the internet, there's just so much. How will historians in a century from now be able to piece together what is happening now? And his sentiment was that, just like in old history, the cream always rise to the top.
Right.
I didn't agree with him. And I don't know if I agree with that, because when you have so many different places to look, even the people who do stay true to the data and piece together what could be the most representative picture of history, who's going to listen to that if they have other places, so many other places to look? So I do hope that we have a more unifying language, but I don't know. That would imply we're back to 3 television stations that everyone watches, and I don't think we're going there.
And of course, I also understand that when I say, we're going through this current climate and we're going to figure our language out, by the time we're 5 years down the line, we'll be going through that climate, and what we figure out now won't be relevant to there. So, I get that what I'm saying probably isn't realistic, but I just wonder sometimes we have a lot of talking across one another, and I don't even mean if we're in different tribes, but just literally with different words. And we have some groups saying, well, this word means this, and other groups saying, well, this word means this. So if we don't even come to agreement on what we're communicating about, how the fuck do we communicate?
I just had that conversation a little while ago with my wife over the word gossip, because I had used it and she actually had a different understanding and definition of it. And so there was a misunderstanding because of that. And then we looked at the word, we looked at the definition, and then we both said how we treat it, and we came to a better understanding, and then it was fine. And that is what happens in relationships or friendships when you care enough to actually be like, well, what did you mean by that? And you talk about it. Unfortunately, we can't do that at scale. So with social media, there's never that opportunity. For every one time I have a long DM with someone where we talk things through and it works out well, there's 100 people who comment that I either ignore or just don't have the bandwidth to actually get into. So that's going to be another challenging aspect of this whole thing.
Hey, look, thanks so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed it. If people want to find out more about you, your podcast, your writings, anything else, derekberes.com, BERES.com, and Derek with a K, DEREK, BERES.com. Anything you want to leave us with? Anything you want to sign off with there, Derek, before we let you go get on with your Monday evening?
I'll just say that I hope everyone has listened to the latest Fat Freddy's drop record, because it's been spinning a lot here the last few weeks. And thank you for having me on, Pat. It was great talking to you.